Okay, everyone, and welcome to another Friday afternoon webinar with NORA. Today, I'm very pleased to have Stefano here. He will be talking about neuro-inspired AI. And neuroscience is also my background, so I'm really looking forward to your talk, Stefano. He will talk about different things, but how to gain inspiration from the brain, I guess, also when it comes to maybe learning, energy efficiency, and so on. So Stefano Nichele is an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science. He's a founder and deputy head of the Applied Artificial Intelligence Research Group. He recently started the Living Technology Lab, where artificial life and complex systems approaches are used to understand intelligence. So, Stefano, the screen is yours. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you, Klaus, for the introduction. Let me share the screen. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes, everything is fine. Present if you turn.
Yeah. All right, so let me just start. First of all, I have to be careful what I say, Klaus, since you are a neuroscientist. Please don't get too disappointed if I say something wrong. So my talk is entitled "Towards a Less Artificial Intelligence." So let me just give a outline of my presentation. I will just spend a couple of minutes presenting our environment at Oslo Met and the motivation for the research we do. And then I will briefly go through things that you know already, I guess, about the AI origins and what is AI today. And but I would like to give my personal explanation and understanding on that. And I would like to highlight some of the problems that we might have with the current paradigm of AI. And then I will talk about biological intelligence on the other hand, which is a very good inspiration and example for us researchers in AI. And then I will talk a bit about how can we move towards a more bio-inspired AI. And I will give, if there is time, some examples of the projects that we have in that direction. So I'm a computer scientist, I'm not a biologist, so bear with me if I say something that you think it's very wrong in regards to biology or imprecise. You can just let me know. I will correct my explanation and slides. But my goal is to give an idea from how a computer scientist might go out of the comfort zone and explore a new area in a multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary way, hopefully to give a contribution in AI. Okay, so our Oslo Met Artificial Intelligence Lab, it's a research center where I'm affiliated, and we are located in the center of Oslo. So our premises are in Pilestredet, and we are a joint center with Oslo Met and Simula Met, part of Simula Labs, as the main contributors to the lab. So we do, of course, research. Some is applied, some is basic research. Today I will focus more on basic research projects, and we have AI research and education. So we have courses at different levels of bachelor and master and PhD. And also we have a collaboration with different groups nationally, internationally, and also with industry. One of the projects, to give an example of what we might be doing, is this AI Mind project. This is a new project, actually not started yet. This is starting now in March. Is one of the 5 Horizon 2020 projects that was awarded in the last round. And this is a large consortium, countries all around Europe, but is coordinated by the Oslo University Hospital. And Oslo Met is a partner in the project dealing with the AI component. So the project is called AI Mind, and here we want to do intelligent digital tools for screening of brain connectivity and dementia. So in this project, we are using both statistical AI methods as well as graph neural networks. So graph neural networks are a deep learning paradigm where the network learns embeddings of nodes in a graph, and nodes in a graph can carry on very rich information about the relation with other nodes and the connection they have. So this is just one of the examples of AI applied to healthcare. And this is not the topic of my talk today. If you want to know about AI in healthcare, I suggest to look at the presentation of my colleague Michael Riegler from some weeks ago at the NORA webinar. I really enjoyed it, so I suggest you look at that presentation. Also, we have an initiative called NordStar. This is a strategic initiative from Oslo-Met for supporting environment of high quality. And we recently got this, recognition from Oslo-Met for a Center for Trustworthy and Sustainable AI, where we have identified 5 areas that can give a contribution to trustworthy and sustainable AI, and namely explainable and understandable model by design, also quantum AI, bio-inspired AI, the topic of my talk today, and then security and privacy in AI design, and human factors in AI. And we are hiring, actually, so if you are looking for a position either as a PhD or a postdoc, I suggest you look at our vacancies. We have 2 openings at the moment. And the Living Technology Lab is my research lab. So here is a group of very diverse, actually, group of people looking at how we can create more bio-inspired approaches to AI. So we take inspiration from biological life and try to make, trying to transport these principles in artificial systems. So we use a life, biological biology as a starting point, and computational neuroscience and complex systems. And we use really a wide variety of methods, ranging from analysis of data from biological neurons to spiking neural network models and more abstract models with cellular automata and evolutionary algorithms and robotics and even art. So what fascinates me is by looking at nature to see how nature is able to produce amazing patterns, amazing designs without any actually without any designer, without any engineering process, just as an emergent process from the bottom up, with the interaction of the components at the low level, giving rise to these emergent complex systems. So this is my motivation for looking into this type of form of designs from nature for the complex systems that are created. And when I say complex system, I don't mean complicated system. So for me, simple systems, in my definition, are systems that are very complicated, maybe, but the parts are completely correlated. So at any moment we can understand how the system works, and we can predict how it will be working in the future. This is a simple system. And also totally independent parts in a system are making a simple system, because there with statistical analysis, we can also get an insight about how the system is working. However, complex systems are systems where there are some components, somehow simple components, interacting at a local level and giving rise to self-organizing behavior over time. So this is a completely bottom-up process. There is no centralized control. There is no designer in this system, and the system is robust in that if you take out one ant from the ant colony, the system still works. So it's kind of robust, resilient. So to quote Aristotle, the whole is more than the sum of its part in the definition of complex system. So while in an engineering approach, we use top-down methods, top-down designs. So we try to decompose the larger system into smaller components, and then into even smaller components, and then put them very precisely together to achieve the given goal. In nature, actually does uses a bottom-up approach, where at the low level there are some components that are self-organizing into a higher level. So this is an emergent process. So what I call the artificial intelligence approach today, it's an approach that tries to engineer top-down intelligence. But what I call instead the artificial life approach. It's an approach that tries to synthesize from the bottom up those lifelike behaviors like intelligence. So I'm interested in this second approach. Okay, so this was a bit of a motivation for me personally, for our lab, to do this kind of research. And so I want to briefly mention what was AI when AI was then starting as a research field, and what is AI today, and what should AI maybe be in the future. This is just my own personal opinion. So here we have three of the seminal works that we all know that contribute to the creation of AI as a field as we know it. Here we have the work on the top left from McCulloch and Pitts, a logical calculus of the ideas immanent in the nervous system. This is a paper from 1943, where McCulloch and Pitts they introduced a model of an electronic neuron. Basically, the idea was that putting together those models of neuron, one could recreate an electronic brain. Also on the right side here, we have the work from Alan Turing. During the 50s, he wrote this paper on computing machinery and intelligence. So in this paper, he was introducing the imitation game, what we know also as a kind of Turing test. And he opened the paper with this consideration on an important question: can machines think? And so the idea is that machine can think implies also that machines have a sort of a mind. And this is quite interesting. And finally, also the first time the term actually AI was used in 56 during this proposal actually for a 2 months project on the Dartmouth summer research project on AI, where very prominent researchers of that time wanted to work together. And they, I quote here, the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning and any other feature of intelligence can in principle be precisely described and simulated in a machine. So the idea was that any property, any feature of learning and intelligence would be achieved in a machine. So this makes me think that the original goal of the field was towards a creation of a general form of intelligence. So creating an artificial brain, a machine that can think, can have perception and reasoning, a sort of mind, machine that is capable of general intelligence. This was a bit the initial idea. So, but looking at today's definitions of AI, this is taken from the document from the European Union, from the high-level expert group on AI, on the definition of the AI. Here they say that AI refers to system designed by humans that, given a complex goal, so there is a complex goal, act in the physical digital world and does many sorts of things, reasoning, knowledge, and knowledge from the data and deciding actions to achieve a given goal. So the idea here is that the definition of AI is towards a given task, a given goal. So it's towards, I would say, a narrow artificial intelligence. So this is a change in paradigm. It's a shift in the view of AI since its origins. And then this leads to the question, what is narrow AI and what is a strong AI? So most of today's efforts are toward solving specific tasks, maybe difficult tasks, or maybe understand some data set better than humans, maybe even things that humans cannot solve or cannot do. This is specific task. While a strong AI is a machine that actually can learn, or in theory perform any task. And so basically it has the ability to learn to learn. So the main question that today I think is relevant to ask is, does scaling up the deep learning models that we have can lead to artificial general intelligence? Is this a reasonable path that may lead to more general AI? So here I have included a slide from a famous debate between Gary Marcus and Jan LeCun from 2017. Actually, they often disagree on many things. They have very opposite views on AI. However, in that debate, they had a set of points in which they were in complete agreement, and some of the points here are quite interesting. So they are agreeing that AI is still in the early stages as a research field. It's not as we maybe think that so much advanced and achieved its goals, rather not. And also machine learning is a necessary component for achieving more general intelligence, and deep learning is one of those techniques. But they both agree that deep learning is not sufficient, and reinforcement learning is not sufficient either for achieving a more general intelligence. So my take-home message for this is that narrow AI is great, and I use deep learning for many types of applications. We should continue to do that. It's very important because the problems that we can solve with deep learning architectures nowadays, it's so useful for society to improve life of people, to solve problems that we cannot solve. I'm thinking, for example, of AlphaFold protein folding, something that it's really remarkable results. So we should continue to expand this research. We should continue to expand the algorithms and apply them to more problems. But what I want to address here is, while this is a very important research direction, is this leading to general intelligence, to adaptable machine? Is this type of architecture explainable? Is it sustainable in the long term? And so my short answer is no. And I will try to explain why I think it's no and what we could do differently. So I will try to address a few points here in terms of sustainability, explainability, and also very important plausibility from a biological point of view of current AI methods. So this is a paper from I think 2019 from Strabel et al. And this is very interesting. So here it's a calculation on basically the amount of carbon dioxide in pounds that is produced by different things. And for example, the round-trip flight from New York to San Francisco is around 2,000 pounds. While, for example, a car lifetime for the entire lifetime, including fuel, 126,000. And actually, a transformer with neural architecture searches is one of the recent language models with 113 million parameters. It's roughly five times the amount of CO2 that is produced by a car. And this is for a single instance of the training process of the transformer. So it's this, and we know that models are trained multiple times throughout the research and development process. This is for a single run. And for example, another model that is not in this table, BERT, that is a language model that is used in Google search by millions of people every day. And this is trained with new data quite often to keep it updated, is roughly comparable to the first item in the list here, a round-trip flight from New York and San Francisco. So this is quite shocking, actually, to see that just for training of the algorithm is producing so much carbon dioxide. And also it's a matter of cost. So how much does it cost? What equipment does one need to actually train and develop these models? And here it's it's an estimate of the cost for training on a cloud platform. I mean, not many have the GPU power and the clusters to train this algorithm in-house. And so if one has to rent the cloud computing to do that, for example, for the transformer I mentioned before, these amounts in between $1 million to $3 million. This is a very shocking number. And this is from 2019. And if we look at BERT, for example, can be around 13,000. And GPT-2, it's not even the newest language model. it's also quite remarkable. So here, this data make me think that what can be the consequence of scaling up those models even more. And actually, recently there has been an increase in the number of models that are just scaled up, that have been released. Just a couple of months ago, DALL-E has been released by OpenAI. This is a 12 billion parameter version of GPT-3. And here you can write a text and you get basically rendered images of this text. So it does the natural language understanding and also the generative component with images. So it's really remarkable result, but this is a 12 billion parameters as compared to, for example, here 213 million parameters. And just a couple of weeks ago, then Google released the Switch Transformer. It's a trillion parameter model for basically understanding and translating languages. And so then this made me think, what does it mean to scale up this model in terms of costs, in terms of environment, and also I try to do some back of the napkin calculation, very simple calculation of what does it mean in terms of actually the brain. If we look at the brain, what are those numbers? So here it's a vague estimation, and so the number of neurons in the brain is something like 10 to the power of 11. And considering that each neuron has roughly around 7,000 synapses, then this leads to around 700 to 1,000 trillion synapses in the brain. This is estimates. The brain runs on 12 watts. This is really remarkable. So 1/5 of a light bulb. And then if we look at the number of neurons in a cubic millimeter of cortex, and this is around 90,000 and roughly 700 million synapses. This is in a tiny cubic millimeter of cortex in our brain. So the Google Brain Switch Transformer as 1 trillion parameters is roughly a cubic centimeter. So a cubic centimeter of brain in terms of synapses, in terms of parameters, while the overall volume of a brain is roughly, for an adult, is around 1,200 cubic centimeters. So these numbers make me think that if we want to scale up this cubic centimeter up to the size of the brain to have a more general intelligence, I'm not sure this is the path that can be taken. So perhaps we should look at how the brain actually does run on 12 watts and does this learning and computation. So one question is, does AI learns like the brain? And because it's the learning process that is the bottleneck for the computation. And we all know that the very successful algorithm that works for deep neural network, the backpropagation of error, is an algorithm that is very efficient, but it has some shortcomings in that from a biological perspective, is considered implausible. This is something that is widely known and recognized by the scientific community. And there are many researchers trying to produce more biologically plausible versions of this training algorithm. Backpropagation is an algorithm that works efficiently, but it's not the algorithm that the brain uses for training. And here we see researchers like Bengio and also Lily Krupp and Blake Richard, cordon cording, trying to explore alternative to this backpropagation paradigm and how the brain might actually train. So they start from the implication that since the backpropagation works so well, then the brain might implement somehow a version of this algorithm, which is quite funny. So my other way of thinking would be, let's look at how the brain does it and then try to make an algorithm that works on the artificial neural network. So let me just briefly go through a few points of a biologically questionable aspect of the backpropagation. Why is it not really biologically plausible? what is the problem here? So for first, backpropagation of errors does not use local errors. So the error backpropagation is done by a separate algorithm. It's a global error calculation. So there is a centralized algorithm that is calculating the global error and then is backpropagating this error downstream to update the synapses in order to reduce this error. And so the biological synapses change their connection on local signals, not on global signals. So this is a big problem. And secondly, in order to backpropagate the error from the last layer backwards, there is an implication that the synapses going forward and backwards, they are symmetric. So basically, the errors are backpropagated using the same weights that are used to propagate the information forward in the network. And while it's possible that there are connections going both ways, it's very difficult to consider that they might have the same weight and they keep aligned. When one is updated, the other one is updated identically. Also, the neural models that are used are simplified. They are not necessarily realistic models. For example, ANNs use artificial neurons that send continuous outputs, basically real numbers. Actual neurons use electrical signals, use spikes. And also another aspect is that the computation inside the neuron is simplified as basically a summation of the inputs. Also, another thing that is difficult to achieve in a biological system is that all the signals from one layer are propagated simultaneously to the next layer. We know that axons in the brain, they can stretch out, they can be very small or a bit longer, and since they are like wires, the signals travel at a different speed. So this speed is it's studied that it's an effect of the length of the connections, but also on the size of the connection, and also age is an important factor. So thinking that everything is streaming at the same speed simultaneously is not really biologically realistic. Also, the fact that there is a comparison of the expected output and the actual output is kind of supervision at the end. And also, yeah, the idea that basically the discrete events produced by neurons, when they cross a certain threshold, they produce a spike. This is not differentiable. We know that differentiability is an important feature of the activation functions of the neurons in order to calculate the gradient. And spiking neurons are not differentiable. And finally, well, in artificial neural network, we have two phases. We have the training phase, where the weights are changed, and then we have the phase where the network is actually used. And then the weights are frozen, are unchanged afterwards. There is no learning after the training. And this is also something that is not biologically plausible, in that there is research showing that synapses in our brain are constantly changing, and memories that are stored are retained while the synapses change. So the memories are changing in the way they are stored throughout time. So it's not a static architecture. So all these points are very important to consider. In that we might improve on some of these points to go more towards brain-inspired and biologically inspired AI. So one of the models that I find fascinating as a computer scientist, that is very simple, but it captures more of the properties of biological neurons, is a spiking neuron. So here we have a neuron, and in the incoming connections, we have discrete event spikes that might come in at different times. And this neuron at some point can produce spikes in output. And it goes like this. So the neuron has some kind of internal potential that accumulates. So whenever there is an input spike, this potential increases. And then it may decrease a little bit over time. It may leak, but then a new spike comes, and this this internal state increases, and then at some point there is a spike that makes the internal state of the neuron go over a threshold, and then an output spike is produced. And while this is not 100% accurate model of a neuron, it captures more of the properties of a neuron, and the training. We all know the Hebbian learning rule: neurons that fire together wire together. So if this neuron spikes and the neuron presynaptic neuron has spiked roughly at the same time, it means that this synapse will get stronger. And whether if this neuron has produced a spike and nothing has happened on a certain synapse, then this synapse is weakened. So a more advanced version of this learning mechanism that is totally local is STDP. So STDP, here we have a presynaptic neuron J and postsynaptic neuron I, and we have a weight connecting them between I and J. And here the idea is that if the postsynaptic neuron spikes right after the presynaptic neuron has spiked, then there is a causal relation between the presynaptic and postsynaptic, and therefore this is the delta, the weight update is a positive. And the more closer and the right before and the more update, and if this has happened after, then it might be that the weight is decreased because there is no causality in the events that have happened. This is quite interesting. And also we have to consider that in the brain there may be excitatory synapses that produce a positive effect on the postsynaptic neuron, and there are inhibitory synapses that produce a negative effect on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so with this interesting model, then how can improve AI? So this question, I would like to rephrase it in a different way. What is biological intelligence then? And how can then biological intelligence be better understood and to inform better AI models? And biological intelligence, it's something like we see in these images. It's something that is moving, cells that are moving, that trying to connect the network to each other, and changing over time. Neurons that try to connect and then decide to disconnect. And so this is something that is very fascinating. So this is what is intelligence, and it's very fascinating. I would like to give an example, a successful example that we can all relate to, on something that that we know, on how to use the world-class neuroscience community in Norway to create better AI models. So here, you all know the Nobel Prize winning research from the Mosers. And here they have discovered two interesting types of cells, two types of neural cells. One is the place cell and one is the grid cell. So what they did, they placed an electrode in the brain of the rat, and this electrode in the entorhinal cortex was able to record from a single neuron. So it was just one neuron they were looking at, and they noticed that while the animal was navigating in some arena, whenever the rat was crossing a specific point in space, that neuron was active. And they named this type of cell place cell. And then they noticed that another type of cell actually was active, not only when the animal was in a specific place, but when the animal was in a very predefined place distributed around the grid. So it's a kind of a navigation system inside the brain. And this is quite interesting. So it's a very good way to explain the behavior of a neural network with a neuroscience research. And here we have work from Vanino and others on actually a vector-based navigation for artificial agents, so using artificial neural networks, AI. So they have an environment, and the agent is exposed to this kind of 3D world, and is given information about the direction and the speed, and the network has to learn to understand where the agent is in the map. And by training this network, there emerge a pattern in the activity of the network that is really resembling the activation patterns that were recognized by the Mosers actually. So this is one example of how we could create bio-inspired AI, explainable AI. So we could relate this to the biological research. So my my next point would be to talk a little bit about how can we move then towards more bio-inspired AI. So one point is to take the brain as an inspiration and develop hardware and AI algorithms that are more scalable and energy efficient and fault tolerant, and of course capable of learning, and doing that by bottom-up approaches. So use models of neurons to guide this this type of development. So how do we do that? So there are some tools that are very useful. One of them is Microelectrode Array. You see here. This is a very important tool for research with neurons. So in that you don't have to use animals for that. So you have this type of electrode array, and this electrode array is inserted in some head stage, and then through this interface board is connected to a computer. And on this tiny petri dish with electrodes, then it's possible to grow cells, to grow neurons. And here you see one example from our collaborator lab, Sandvik lab at NTNU, where they grow biological neurons, neural cells, starting from stem cells, so cells that are not specialized. Then through some biotechnology methods, they are able to specialize them into neural cells, and then those neural cells, they self-organize into neural networks, biological neural networks. And here you see that the black dots are the electrodes with some tiny wires and electrodes where we can record the signals that the neurons send, and we can also stimulate the neurons with electrical signals. And you can, I think, notice the lighter areas with clusters of neurons connected together, and also you can see the connections of different strengths, different lengths also. Some are very thin and some are quite thick. This is a microscope image. And then, what is possible to do, as I said, this electrode array is inserted into the head stage, and then the network grows over several days and then self-organizes into a neural network. And here you can designate some inputs and you can designate some outputs, and you can record the activity or stimulate. Then you have a view like this one, where each box represents the electrical activity on one of those electrodes. And then, of course, you can do some signal analysis. You can filter out noise, and you can understand what type of activity does the network has. And then many types of interesting analysis can be done. I don't want to go into too much into the details here, but so since those electrodes do not necessarily record from a single neuron, but we can think that we are sampling from an underlying population of neurons, it's possible then to reconstruct, to infer some kind of a functional connectivity network from the biological neural network underlying in the MEA. And through cross correlation of the activity on the electrodes, we can infer what are the most active nodes and what are the strengths of the connections between them. And also, it's possible to do some analysis on the spikes, doing some spike sorting, looking at the shape of the signals produced. It's possible to see that there are different shapes maybe on one electrode, and then understand how many neurons, what kind of neurons are recorded by that electrode, and who fires first and who fires after, and such things. Okay, so this leads me to the brief presentation of some of the ongoing projects in this direction. So the goal here is to give a few ideas without going in depth into the results, but I'm very open to talking more with you if you want to collaborate or know more details. So here in the Socrates Project, this is a collaboration with NTNU and Oslo Met. Here we have this idea of biological neural networks as an inspiration to understand how they self-organize, what are their dynamics, and then make models of this, and then transfer this type of model into a possible hardware for machine learning. in this case is a nanomagnetic system. So it's something that can be built at the nanoscale, very small, very energy efficient, and is based on basically the spin of the nanomagnets. So the nanomagnet can have a spin in different directions, and this can somehow replicate some of the dynamical neural activity that we observed in the neural network. So this type of substrate is now being built in the nanolab at NTNU as a proof of concept that machine learning can be done in substrates that are neural-inspired with low energy consumption. And another proof of concept that we have created is what we call a cyborg, in fact. So this is a closed loop system. So in this closed loop, we have three components. We have the biological neural network on MEA, and then we have some kind of artificial intelligence, typically a single layer neural network. This image is 2 layers, but typically single layer artificial neurons. And this reads and classifies the signals from the biological neural network. And then this basically activates either the left or the right motors on the robot. It is composed of 2 motors and sensors like eyes. So it's a sensory feedback, and the sensors measures the distance from objects. So and this sensory feedback is sent back as a stimulation to some of the electrodes of this biological network. So we create a kind of experiment where instead of having an animal, we have a kind of simulated robot. You see here a simulated robot with 4 eyes, for example, that is moving around in this arena and has to avoid the walls. And you see that when it comes quite close to the wall, the sensory input changes, and this corresponds to a stimulation on some of the electrodes on this neural network. So basically, the neural network controller is then changing over time, and the goal here is to avoid crashing into objects. So this is a nice example of how we could have similar experiments, similar setup to the ones that are used typically in neuroscience research with animals and behavior and analysis of the neural networks, but with artificial systems and robots and machines. Also, another thing that we do is look at properties of the biological neural networks in terms of what is their behavior. So here we look at how many electrodes are active and when, and based on this, we see if the activity, for example, dies out very fast, or if the activity produces avalanches, so-called, that basically spread through the network, or if this activity then degenerates and takes over the entire network. And by doing that, we can see that, for example, from the electrical activity on the recording of a biological neural network over time, we can see that the distribution of those avalanches in some cases follows a nice power law distribution here. And this is observed also in the brain network. And this is a good indication that the neural network has a high capability for computation. And by doing that in biological neural networks, the goal is to transfer this to artificial neural networks. So the ability to manipulate the neural networks enables us to produce behavior that are good for machine learning, for example, with recurrent neural networks, and reservoir computing. And reservoir computing is a nice paradigm. I don't want to go into the details now. I just want to give the intuition. It's a paradigm for training recurrent neural network where the neural network weights are not trained, and it's difficult for us to train the network of a biological neural network. So it sounds like a reasonable model for us. And the only thing that we train is the output layer. So the output layer is an external layer that we train to classify. And the idea here is that this substrate is a dynamical system that if is in a critical state that produces this complex pattern, then it can represent the input in a way that is easy to separate, easy to recognize in output. And we have just started a new project called DeepCA, where we want to use this paradigm on two types of architecture. One is the neural network, biological neural network on the Petri dish, and as well as we want to do it on the simplest dynamical system that we can think of, like a cellular automata. And we have some proof of concept of this, for example, on the MNIST data set, where with this simple cellular automata, we can propagate the activity based on the input pixels of the image. And we can classify based only on the local interaction of these components. Now this video is not working well. I think it's not working on the output here. Let me see if sometimes it stops. It should anyways pop up that it's the class 0 that is activated. Yeah, this time it has worked. And another research direction that we are looking at in collaboration with the University of Trieste in Italy is on voxel-based soft robots. The robots that are made of soft materials and can be controlled by this biologically plausible neural network. So I hope that I gave you a kind of idea of this research field. I have some take-home thoughts. Future AI machines, I envision that they will have simple units interacting locally and without centralized control. Rather, the design paradigm will be a bottom-up design with evolution that will be taking care of evolving the genetic representations of AI, and also development of the computational structure through self-organization. Like in biological systems, we have multi-cellular organisms that are growing from a single cell, and the adaptation, the learning part, will be through local learning rules. I would like to thank some of the funding agencies and collaborators for this type of projects. And I would like to advertise actually the Artificial Life 2021 conference, if in case you're interested in this topic of bio-inspired cognitive and AI and machine learning using this A-Life perspective. And I would like to thank you by closing with yet another weird project on plant intelligence. So in case you're interested in exploring more of the artistic side of this. Thank you then, class. If I think I was a bit over time, but if maybe there is still a little bit of time for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Stefano, for a very interesting talk. And I totally agree in what you say. The AI community should definitely take advantage of the very strong neuroscience community in Norway. As you mentioned, we have the Mosers with Nobel Prizes, but you have a long tradition. Fridtjof Nansen was actually the first Norwegian to take a PhD in neuroscience. And then a really good community was built up around Per Andersen's lab at the University of Oslo, where also the Mosers were. And actually there, Terje Lømo discovered a long-term potentiation mechanism for changing the weights of synapses. And that was already in 1966, I think, more than 50 years ago. So we have a long tradition, and we have a strong community. And Stefano and I, we have also been talking about doing some projects on this. Stefano had this initiative of trying to, under the NORA umbrella, to gather and make something out of the collaboration between the neuroscience communities and the AI communities. So we will try to have some meetings about this. So if you are interested in this bio-inspired AI or neuro-inspired AI, please just write me an email, and we will try to have a meeting and talk more about this very exciting topic. We have some questions, Stefano, so we will try to go through some of them. I'll just start by the first ones. One question is, what methods exist today to reduce the energy consumption of deep learning models? Can deep learning itself be used for it?
Yes, so it's an interesting question. So it's two questions. So the first one is like, let's start from the second one. Can deep learning itself be used to reduce it? So in that sense, yes, I think it's definitely a good idea to use deep learning as a optimization algorithm. So basically optimize the way tasks are executed, scheduled. And there are examples of that on I think Google is using methods to reduce the energy consumptions of their system by having intelligent allocation of tasks, and also other tricks, I think, to reduce basically one of the biggest energy consumptions of the data centers is the cooling systems. So by optimizing how the systems are cooled through AI, then some energy can be saved. So this is one way of using AI to reduce the consumption produced by running AI. But still would not be, in my opinion, the answer, because anyways, if we have to scale up the systems themselves, it will be more the consumption than what we gain by optimizing it. So we should look into alternative methods to train. So the bottleneck is the training, is the part of the AI model that takes more time and is more compute intensive. So we should find better ways of training the networks. And deep learning models, if you intend by deep learning model deep neural networks, there is nothing wrong with the architectures themselves. It's the learning method that has to go through so many iterations and with such large data that takes time.
Exactly. And as we mentioned, we have a tradition for studying learning in the brain in Norway, so we should continue that. And also this spike timing, STDP is the important timing of spikes. And more neuromorphic computing tools are also coming. So we will have also hardware that is very energy efficient in that sense.
So if one, let's say, changes the paradigm to spiking neural network and uses that as a model, then there are neuromorphic architectures that basically in hardware can run exactly this mechanism of propagating spikes. So this is much more energy efficient to run on a specific hardware than running on a GPU. Traditional neural networks. So it's a hardware that is built and supporting this type of model natively. So
yeah,
optimized.
Exactly. I will go to the next questions. We have a lot of questions actually. So and that's nice. I think we will not finish everything before 3, but maybe you have time to stay a little bit more, Stefano, and we will go through them. The work that is from Sandvik Lab, is this a precursor to the Neuralink somehow?
Mm-hmm. This is a nice question, and also I'm not an ethicist also, so I don't want to go into a slippery road. But so yes, so the idea here is that the neural networks grown on the Petri dishes here, in a way they are to avoid also using or testing injecting electrodes in animal brains or in human brains for research. So, however, work like the Neuralink are very interesting from a medical perspective also, because there are people suffering from neural diseases, and therefore implanting electrodes in the brain to stimulate electrical activity in certain areas is definitely very important. So one way of testing some properties, testing some theory in a model system is to use a Petri dish and grow the neurons there. So in a sense, yes, you could think of a model system for doing related research to the Neuralink. However, the Neuralink has also some other goals that I will not want to mention related to business and yeah.
If you want to know more about Neuralink, actually, I've been participating in 2 podcasts, Norde podcast with Inga Strymke and Gaute Einevold. So if you Google them, you will probably find them. And there we talk a lot about the Neuralink. This was actually my research field before I started in the AI community to try to understand the extracellular potentials, the fields originating from the neurons, and also how to stimulate neurons then. Yes, next question. Also, how scalable are the Petri dish models? Can you compare the brain scale networks to Petri dish in number of neurons and the connections?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a very relevant question. So first of all, we shouldn't call the populations of neurons that are grown in such environments brains. So they have nothing like brains. They are not organized like brains. They don't have all the neural types like brains. They don't have all the cells that they don't have a body. So they are not brains. So they are neural populations. But the technology is evolving fast. So I think it's difficult to count the cells there, but you can go up to a few hundred thousands to millions of cells. And there are new ways of also growing them, not only in 2D, because the one that I showed is 2 dimensions, but there are also possibility of 3D electrodes with scaffoldings that grow in 3D. So to have a better model of basically neural networks that are in 3D in the brain. So yes, still small enough to do some research, but in a way it's bigger than for example, some living organisms like some insects, so it's smaller in comparison with a human brain, but bigger than some living beings.
Following up question from me, I guess in the brain also like neuromodulatory systems are important, like dopamine reward systems and so on. These are not there in the Petri dish, right? So
well, so in a way I skipped a bit on this part because I also had a lot of examples to talk about, but I didn't talk about that specifically. But it's possible to do also this type of perturbation to the networks we have. For example, if the networks are not in the type of dynamic that we want, and we see that they are either in the supercritical and subcritical region, we can use some GABA, for example, to increase inhibition and then perturb the synapses. And therefore, it's possible to use this type of perturbation in the Petri dish as well.
Yep, exactly. It's actually a bit interesting because AI has a lot of inspiration from neuroscience, but actually on this field also neuroscience has some inspiration from AI, because I think the temporal difference method in AI was kind of used to understand the dopamine system, that actually you don't release dopamine, you don't release the reward dependent on the outcome, but rather the difference between the expected outcome and the outcome. So this was actually there in AI before, and they understood the same mechanism in the brain. So that's kind of also interesting. There, Fabian Bolte has a question. Thank you for the interesting talk. Can you say a few words to where you see knowledge graphs in the picture of biological AI?
I'm not sure what's implied here by knowledge graphs.
I guess he's into the Gary Marcus Hinton debate, maybe, whether deep learning can do it all, or whether you need tools like, for example, knowledge graphs, maybe.
I guess then if that's the question, I'll jump over it and I'll not get into this discussion. I will not take a position in that.
I understand.
It's a relevant question, but yeah.
I understand very well. Next question. The grown cells on a Petri dish form a chaotic system. In this case, how do you assure repeatability, given that such systems are very sensitive to initial conditions?
Very, very important question. So the network that you obtain in one experiment is different from the network you obtain in another experiment. And like our brains are different from each other, so they are not connected in the same way. So, but what is important is that we look at the dynamics of the network and we see that it has certain properties, and this is a good indication that the network, for example, is healthy and is able to get information and compute and process it and produce some output. So yeah, the initial conditions are the same, but the network then grows and self-organizes into a different system. It's not that important from a machine learning perspective when you use a reservoir computing paradigm. There you have a dynamical system that, as long as some properties that basically it does not amplify the input, and this takes over in a large avalanche over the network, and therefore you can get out nothing, or it has a very boring synchronous static pattern in output, so independent from the type of input that you have. But if you have a wide variety of dynamics, then you can perturb the system and perhaps use this representation for then classifying your output. So in that sense, so besides the medical implications of having a healthy network and having possible signals that the network is not healthy anymore, it can be also used for machine learning, and it has been used widely in reservoir computing.
Next question is about generic AI. Is it even possible, based on the theories the current narrow AI is based, which is based on the past theories, which is still based on past?
Well, I don't understand very much the question, but what I can say, so I didn't want to talk much about the meaning of general AI and what are the philosophical implications of that. But so for me, it's not a very interesting question about creating general AI. In that, in theory, for example, my brain, in theory, can be a general intelligence, but I can bake a pie, but I cannot change the pipes in the bathroom or in the kitchen. So I'm not a general. So theoretically, maybe one can learn, but it's more interesting to have the possibility to adapt, to change. Online learning, lifelong learning, transfer learning are very interesting concept towards a more generic AI. I'm not a big fan of the super intelligence of a machine that can do everything at a superhuman level, but able to adapt, change, and yeah, without forgetting too much. It's something that we should aim at.
Yeah, and another following up or comment, we will say, yeah, if we are going to step into the generic AI world, it should as well be invented first, bottom up, or I should say inside out.
So what I can comment on this question is that we have one good example of how somewhat general intelligence was achieved in looking at biological intelligence, and in that sense, the designer of this intelligence was natural evolution. So evolution is the tool that over many generations, over a long time scale, does the meta learning. So basically, the networks that are more suitable to survive in an environment and perform well are more likely to survive and go to the next generation. So the learning time scale within the lifetime of an agent, of an AI, or a biological organism is a shorter time scale. So what learning ensures is that we are able to acquire things from the environment and learn to do things, while the evolutionary part ensures that the substrate is suitable for the learning. The substrate is suitable to learn what should be learned to survive. So I think there are many, let's say, learning time scales that should be taken into account into the generic AI. The learning at the evolutionary scale, the learning at the developmental stage, and basically the learning throughout the lifetime. So basically through the synaptic change in the brain. So
absolutely. I guess also maybe the question was a reference to Bushaki's book, The Brain Inside Out, where they discuss the concepts. Should we build new concepts from the neuroscience and out to cognitive science, or should we stand by these cognitive science concepts and try to find them in the brain? This is also an interesting question. Next question from Torbjørn. Presumably, biology is efficient because neurons are directly connected with a single wire axon, while computers need to do a lot of work to look up neurons in memory and so on. To really make the machine learning more efficient, do you think it will need to go towards directly physically connecting neurons with wires?
It's an interesting thought. Yes, the wiring is complicated in computers, and yes, so I think maybe substrate that can natively support this type of models are important. So there is a lot of research also in nanomaterials, in how materials that can actually self-organize and create this type of structures that resemble the connectivity of the brain. Actually, in one of my previous projects, I worked with carbon nanotube materials. So it's tiny carbon nanotubes that are placed over some microelectrode arrays. And there you can also stimulate with current, and you can create different kinds of circuit by basically placing currents into different electrodes and making the material self-organized. So this kind of material might open up new possibilities in the future to create substrate where you can actually simulate also the connectivity of the brain.
Very interesting. And following up to that, what are the synapse equivalent in the nanomagnetic material you mentioned?
So so it's a different substrate, and basically the idea is that it's a nanomagnetic field. So basically there is a change in orientation of the magnets, and there you can apply some field, some magnetic field to make them move basically, and then they interact each other on a local level. So basically, if there is some magnetic field around, then they align on some kind of I wouldn't say this is the equivalent of a synapse, so I don't think maybe there is a direct mapping to that. What we were more interested was to actually have the same dynamic type of behavior as in the spiking behavior of the biological neural networks. I wouldn't be able to make a exact equivalent of a synapse. It's a good question. Definitely worth to look into more.
Next question is Roger Penrose says consciousness is not an emergent phenomenon. What do you guys think? Is it computable?
Okay, this is more like into the philosophical domain. So no, so in my opinion, it is computable and it is emergent. But also there is another layer that I like to add in my thinking, that is the embodiment. So the layer of embodiment. So I struggled to think of a conscious machine that is just algorithmic and is not physical. There is no embodiment. There is no sensory feedback. So it's this question whether brain and body, what is more important, or whether they have to be there together. And so I think that for a neural network to be considered at some point a conscious machine, it does not have to be, let's say, image classification, get an input, produce an output, get an input, produce an output, but it has to be placed in some kind of embodied system with a feedback loop. It has to have a body, so to acquire some form of consciousness. But yes, so it might be an emergent process of this close relation between body and brain.
I also have to mention Roger Penrose was actually the one who inspired me. I'm a physicist of background, but I was reading his book Shadows of the Mind, and this is a long time ago, which is about the question here, consciousness and what could be consciousness in the brain. He's talking about structures called microtubuli in the brain and quantum states. Personally, I don't think it's very realistic, but it's at least very inspiring. So it was very inspiring to me to go from as a physicist to go into neuroscientist with my physics toolbox and background. And this also brings up the kind of next question, which is a question to both of you. Your favorite book on the topic for beginners? Do you have any recommendations, Stefano?
So on a broader, even broader scale, on the complex systems idea, basically, I think it's a very good starting point. I can suggest books, for example, from Yanir Bariam, is researchers at Next Institute in New England Complex System Institute, and there's a very nice book on complex systems that tries to summarize basically all the ideas around the systems that are complex and that are all around us at the different scales, from the tiny scale to the macro scale of the planets and societies and cities. And I think to get the idea of this emergent phenomenon, self-organizing, it's a very good starting point. Also, I can suggest Melanie Mitchell, Complexity, a Guided Tour. It's also a very good introductory book. I really like. She is formerly affiliated to the Santa Fe Institute of Complex System, but she's now one of the most prominent researchers in AI in the US. So she's also writing bestseller books, so easy to read.
Yeah. To me, it was Roger Penrose who made kind of my switch into neuroscience. So I should recommend that. It's not a beginner's book, I think, but it's very interesting if you have a physics background. So that depends also pretty much on your background, I guess, which book you should read. One last question now. Again, that's a following up question from Torbjörn about the synapses in the nanomagnetic material, I think. The question is, can the material learn then?
Yes, so there are two answers here. So the short answer, if you look only at the material itself, if it's a static material, like it's built in a way, it does not change. Does this mean that it doesn't learn? I don't know. So in my view, even if let's say the substrate is a kind of a physically built in a way, you can still let's say apply electrical or magnetic signals such that the circuit, the material organizes in a certain way, and therefore produces different input-output mappings. So if you then apply different programming signal to the material, that the material goes into a different type of state, this, in my opinion, is a form of learning. So of course, it's not the physical learning of the synapse or the physical change in the material, but it's a way of programming the material such that it produces a different output. Therefore, it's kind of learning to do a different type of computation. I don't have a better answer than that. So if you look at just the material itself, it doesn't change physically. So, but still, if, for example, I think of again the example of with the carbon nanotubes. The carbon nanotube may be placed in a certain way, but if you apply certain current in some places in the material, you change the electrical properties of the carbon nanotubes, and therefore the electrons flow in a different way inside the nanotube. So you are changing the circuit, but physically you look at it's the same, just the underlying physical properties that are different. Anyways, the complex, it's not an easy question to answer. So
absolutely
thank you,
not,
Torbjörn, for the tough questions also.
Good questions, and I am sure Torbjörn will also join us on the Neuro AI events, which will be probably organized in the future. Also, when it comes to book and the different types of learning you talked about, because you mentioned also learning over generations, learning in hardware versus learning in software. I would also recommend, I think also Max Tegmark's book is quite good, Life 3.0. That's a more popular book, which is quite interesting and amusing. So by that, we finished our questions, Stefano. So I will just again say thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk, and I'm sure we will keep in touch.
Thanks for the invitation, and see you later.
Thank you very much.